My mom sent me a message saying, "We changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore." Dad added, finally throwing out the family trash. Sister cackled, "About time we got rid of the parasite." I replied, "How funny how brave they think they are, haha." Then, 2 days later, I got a frantic email from their attorney, "We have a problem. Call immediately." I'm Rachel, and this is the story of how my family thought they could destroy me, only to discover they had severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when I woke up to 3 messages that would change everything. The first was from my mother, Elaine, "We changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore." The second came from my father, Charles, finally throwing out the family trash. The third was from my sister, Emma, who had always been the golden child, "About time we got rid of the parasite." I stared at my phone screen, reading those messages over and over again. 31 years old, and my own family had just kicked me out of the house I'd been living in for the past 6 months while I recovered from a brutal car accident that had left me unable to work. The same house where I'd grown up, where I'd celebrated birthdays and Christmases, where I thought I belonged. But here's what they didn't know about me, what they'd never bothered to learn despite raising me for 18 years before I moved out for college. I wasn't just their disappointing daughter who'd struggled to find her footing after graduation. I wasn't just the family disappointment who'd bounced between jobs and relationships. I was someone who had spent the last decade quietly building something they couldn't even comprehend. You see, while Emma was becoming their precious senior marketing director at age 28 and while they were busy telling everyone how proud they were of their successful daughter, I was working in cybersecurity. Not the glamorous kind you see in movies, but the real, nitty-gritty kind where you learn exactly how vulnerable people really are when they think they're safe behind their computers and smartphones. I took a screenshot of their messages and replied with a simple, "How funny how brave they think they are, haha." Then I got to work. The first thing I did was check my laptop. Thankfully, I'd had it with me when they'd apparently decided to stage their little intervention. My clothes and personal items were replaceable, but my computer contained years of carefully gathered information. Information that suddenly became very, very relevant. Let me back up and explain how we got here, because this wasn't just a random family dispute. This was the culmination of years of systematic emotional abuse disguised as tough love. Growing up, I was always the odd one out. Emma was 5 years younger but somehow always 3 steps ahead in my parents' eyes. She was outgoing where I was quiet, confident where I was thoughtful, social where I preferred books. Elaine and Charles made it clear from early on that Emma was their success story, while I was their project, something that needed fixing. When I graduated high school with a 3.8 GPA and got into a decent state university for computer science, they complained that I wasn't going to an Ivy League school like they'd hoped. When I graduated college and got my first job in tech, they complained that I wasn't making enough money. When I got promoted and my salary increased, they complained that I wasn't married yet. When I finally found someone I cared about, they complained that he wasn't good enough for their standards. The pattern was always the same: nothing I did was ever enough, while everything Emma did was celebrated like she just won a Nobel Prize. The breaking point had come 6 months earlier when I was driving home from a work conference in the middle of a winter storm. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into my car, leaving me with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a leg injury that required 2 surgeries. I was out of work for months, and my savings quickly evaporated between medical bills and living expenses. When I asked if I could stay in my childhood bedroom while I recovered, the same room that had remained virtually unchanged since I'd left for college, my parents reluctantly agreed. But they made sure I knew it was a burden. Every day, there were comments about how long I was taking to heal, how I needed to get back on my feet, how I was taking advantage of their generosity. Emma, meanwhile, would visit with her fiancé David and make pointed comments about some people not being able to take care of themselves. She'd grown into the kind of person who mistook cruelty for wit, and our parents ate it up. The final straw came when I overheard Elaine on the phone with her sister, talking about how embarrassed she was to have a 28-year-old daughter living at home like a failure. She went on to say that I was probably exaggerating my injuries to avoid going back to work, and that she and Charles were enabling me by not kicking me out sooner. That's when I realized something important: they didn't see me as family anymore. They saw me as an inconvenience, a burden, something to be discarded when it was no longer useful. And if that's how they wanted to play it, then I was going to show them exactly what happens when you discard someone who knows all your secrets. Because here's the thing about growing up in a family that never really accepted you: you become very good at observing. You notice things. You remember conversations. You pay attention to details that other people miss. And when you work in cybersecurity, you develop certain skills that make you very, very good at finding information that people think they've hidden. Over the years, I'd noticed some interesting patterns in my family's behavior. Charles would often take business trips that didn't quite add up geographically. Elaine would have mysterious phone calls that she'd end abruptly when anyone entered the room. Emma's lifestyle seemed to exceed what someone in her position should reasonably be able to afford. I'd never acted on these observations before because, despite everything, they were still my family. But their messages that Tuesday morning changed something fundamental in me. If they wanted to treat me like an enemy instead of their daughter, then I was going to respond accordingly. The first thing I did was run a comprehensive background check on all three of them. This wasn't illegal, all the information was publicly available if you knew where to look and how to compile it. What I found was far more interesting than I'd expected. Charles, it turned out, had been living a double life for over a decade. Those business trips? They were visits to see his other family, a woman named Patricia and their twin 8-year-old sons in a city 3 hours away. He'd been maintaining 2 households for years, which explained why he was always so stressed about money despite his decent salary as an insurance adjuster. While he wasn't technically married to Patricia, he'd been presenting himself as her committed partner and filing taxes claiming to be single with no dependents, while also filing jointly with Elaine and claiming Emma and me as dependents when we were younger. Elaine's mysterious phone calls were to a gambling addiction hotline and various creditors. She'd been systematically stealing money from her employer, a small nonprofit where she worked as an accountant, to feed a poker addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. The amounts were substantial enough to constitute felony embezzlement, over $150,000 across 3 years. And Emma? Sweet, successful Emma who made such a show of her moral superiority? She was running an elaborate insurance fraud scheme with her fiancé David. They'd been staging minor accidents and filing false claims across multiple insurance companies for the past 2 years. It was sophisticated enough that they'd avoided detection so far, but sloppy enough that the patterns were clearly visible once you knew what to look for. What had started as a few $1,000s in fraudulent claims had escalated to over $80,000 in total theft. My perfect family, who'd spent years making me feel like I was the disappointment, were criminals. All of them. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. First, I wanted to see just how far they were willing to push this. I spent the rest of that Tuesday finding a furnished apartment I could rent month to month and arranging to have my belongings retrieved from their house. I didn't contact them or try to negotiate. If they wanted me gone, then I'd be gone. Over the next few days, I watched their social media accounts as they painted the narrative of finally being free from their toxic daughter. Emma posted a long Facebook rant about how families sometimes have to make hard choices to protect themselves from manipulative members. Elaine shared articles about adult children who take advantage of their parents' generosity. Charles posted motivational quotes about cutting dead weight from your life. They were all so pleased with themselves, so confident that they'd finally solve their problem child situation. They had no idea what was coming. On Friday, I sent each of them a simple message: I hope you're enjoying your new freedom. Make sure you savor it while it lasts. None of them responded, which was fine. I wasn't looking for a conversation. Over the weekend, I prepared 3 detailed reports. Each one contained a comprehensive overview of evidence related to their respective illegal activities, complete with financial records, photographs, documented patterns, and expert analysis. I'd spent years developing these skills professionally, and I'd never had a more motivated client than myself. Charles's report documented his tax fraud, identity fraud, and deception related to claiming dependents and filing status across 2 different states. It included photographs of him with Patricia and the children, copies of lease agreements, utility bills, and financial records showing he'd been maintaining 2 households while claiming to be a single father on various tax documents filed in Patricia's state, while simultaneously filing jointly with Elaine in our state. Elaine's report outlined her embezzlement scheme with mathematical precision, showing exactly how she'd been skimming money from donation funds and grant money over a 3-year period. I cross-referenced her gambling activity with the missing funds and created a timeline that would make any prosecutor weep with joy how airtight the case was. Emma's report was perhaps the most detailed, since her scheme was the most complex. I'd traced the pattern of staged accidents, documented fraudulent claims, identified fake medical reports, and even found communications between her and David discussing their methods. The total fraud amount was significant enough to warrant federal charges. Monday morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the IRS fraud hotline, where I submitted a detailed report about Charles's tax fraud and identity deception. The second was to the nonprofit board where Elaine worked, where I provided evidence of her embezzlement along with suggestions for conducting their own internal audit. The third was to the National Insurance Crime Bureau, where I submitted Emma's case as part of their ongoing efforts to combat organized insurance fraud. Then I sat back and waited. It didn't take long. Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after they'd kicked me out, I received an email from an attorney named Harrison Webb. The subject line read, "Urgent, family legal matter requiring immediate attention." The message was brief. "Ms. Rachel Williams, I represent your parents Charles and Elaine Williams, as well as your sister Emma Williams. We have a problem. Call immediately." I waited until Wednesday to respond, because I wanted them to sweat a little longer. When I finally called Mr. Webb, his voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Ms. Williams, I need to ask you directly, did you file reports with federal and state agencies regarding your family members?" I exercised my civic duty to report suspected criminal activity to the appropriate authorities, I replied calmly. "Is there something specific you needed to discuss?" There was a long pause. "Your family is facing serious criminal charges. Your father is being investigated by the IRS and may face charges for tax fraud and identity fraud. Your mother has been suspended from her job and is under investigation for embezzlement. Your sister and her fiancé are facing multiple felony charges related to insurance fraud." "That sounds very concerning for them," I said. "But I'm not sure what this has to do with me." "Ms. Williams," he said, and I could hear him struggling to maintain his professional demeanor, "your family believes this is retaliation for asking you to leave their home. They're prepared to offer a formal apology and invite you back if you're willing to. Reconsider your cooperation with these investigations." I laughed. Actually laughed out loud. "Mr. Webb, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't report them because they kicked me out. I reported them because they're criminals. The timing is just unfortunate for them. Surely we can work something out," he pressed. "Your family is willing to make amends." "My family made their position very clear last week," I said. "They don't consider me family anymore, remember? They changed the locks. They threw out the trash. They got rid of the parasite. I'm just a stranger now who happened to notice some suspicious activity and reported it to the proper authorities." Another long pause. "What would it take for you to help resolve this situation?" "I'm afraid that's not possible," I replied. "You see, once you report criminal activity to federal agencies, you can't just take it back because you've hurt someone's feelings. The investigations are now in the hands of professionals who are much better equipped than I am to determine whether crimes were actually committed. Ms. Williams, have a great day, Mr. Webb. And please tell my former family that I hope they enjoy the consequences of their choices." I hung up and immediately received a flurry of calls from Elaine, Charles, and Emma. I didn't answer any of them, but I did listen to their voicemails. Elaine was crying, begging me to fix this and promising that they'd all been so wrong about me. Charles was angry, demanding that I clean up this mess and threatening to sue me for defamation. Emma was the most interesting. She was trying to play it cool, suggesting that maybe we could all work together to make this misunderstanding go away. I deleted all the messages without responding. Over the next few months, I watched their lives systematically unravel through a combination of public records, news reports, and social media. Charles was the first to fall. The IRS investigation moved quickly once they had a roadmap to follow, and it turned out that maintaining two families across state lines while committing tax fraud had created a paper trail that was impossible to deny. He was arrested at work on a Tuesday morning, and the local newspaper ran a story about a local insurance agent charged with tax fraud and identity fraud. Patricia, his other family, apparently had no idea about Elaine and the kids. She filed a restraining order immediately and took the twins to stay with her sister in another state. Elaine's situation was almost more pathetic. The nonprofit where she'd worked for 12 years held a press conference announcing that they'd discovered significant financial irregularities and were cooperating with law enforcement. She'd stolen over $150,000 over 3 years, money that was supposed to go to programs for low-income families. The gambling addiction that had driven her to steal was bad enough, but stealing from a charity made it a particularly ugly story that local media covered extensively. Emma's case was the most complex, but also the most satisfying to watch unfold. Insurance fraud investigations move slowly, but they're incredibly thorough. Once the National Insurance Crime Bureau started digging, they found connections to other similar schemes and realized that Emma and David were part of a larger network. What had started as a relatively small-scale operation had connections to organized crime, which meant federal charges and the possibility of serious prison time. The best part was watching their social media accounts go dark one by one as their legal troubles became public. Emma's smug Facebook posts about toxic family members were still visible, creating a delicious irony that wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story. About 6 months after my conversation with Mr. Webb, I received another call from their attorney. This time, his tone was completely different. "Ms. Williams, I need to inform you that your parents and sister are interested in accepting plea agreements in their respective cases. However, the prosecutors are asking for victim impact statements. Your father's case involves tax fraud that affects all taxpayers. Your mother's case involves theft from a nonprofit that serves your local community. Your sister's case involves fraud that increases insurance costs for everyone." "Okay," I said. "What does that have to do with me?" "The prosecutors would like to know if you'd be willing to provide a victim impact statement, given that you're a taxpayer, a member of the community served by the nonprofit, and someone who pays insurance premiums." I considered this for a moment. Will I be able to speak directly to the court about how their actions affected me personally? Yes, that's exactly what a victim impact statement is for. Then yes, I'd be very interested in participating in that process. "Ms. Williams," he said carefully, "I should mention that your family is hoping you might be willing to speak about their positive qualities, their remorse, and their potential for rehabilitation." "Mr. Webb," I replied, "I'm going to be completely honest in my statement about how their actions affected me and the community. If that helps them, great. If it doesn't, well, they should have thought about that before they decided to become criminals." The victim impact statements were scheduled for the following month, which gave me plenty of time to prepare. During those weeks of preparation, something interesting happened. I started receiving messages from other people who had been affected by my family's crimes. The nonprofit where Elaine worked had published a victim notification in the local newspaper, and several families reached out to me after learning I was the one who had reported the embezzlement. One message particularly stood out. It was from Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who had been receiving assistance from the nonprofit for childcare while she attended nursing school. "Because of what your mother stole," Maria wrote, "the program ran out of funding 3 months early. I had to drop out of school and take a minimum wage job just to survive. I want you to know that reporting her was the right thing to do, even though she's your family." That message hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about abstract numbers on financial statements. Elaine's gambling addiction had directly derailed a woman's dream of becoming a nurse and providing a better life for her children. There were real faces behind the crimes my family had committed, real people whose lives had been damaged by their selfish choices. I started researching the other victims more thoroughly. The nonprofit Elaine had stolen from served over 200 low-income families in our community. The childcare program that had been cut short due to her embezzlement affected 37 children whose parents were trying to improve their situations through education or job training. The after-school tutoring program that lost funding served kids who were struggling academically and needed extra support. Emma's insurance fraud had broader implications too. I reached out to an actuary friend from college who explained how fraud like Emma's affected everyone's premiums. "Every fake claim gets factored into the risk calculations," he explained. "Honest policyholders end up paying higher rates to compensate for the losses from fraud." Over the course of Emma's scheme, she probably cost other policyholders tens of thousands of dollars in increased premiums. Charles's tax fraud was perhaps the most personally insulting. While I was struggling to pay my medical bills and living expenses after my accident, he was cheating the system that funded the social safety net programs I might have needed. Every dollar he avoided paying in taxes was a dollar that couldn't go toward helping people like me who were dealing with legitimate hardships. The more research I did, the angrier I became. Not just at the crimes themselves, but at the hypocrisy. These were the same people who had spent years lecturing me about responsibility and moral character. Elaine had constantly criticized my spending habits while she was stealing thousands of dollars to feed her gambling addiction. Charles had given me speeches about contributing to society while he was committing tax fraud. Emma had made snide comments about my life choices while she was running elaborate insurance scams. I decided to expand my victim impact statement to include these broader perspectives. I reached out to Maria Santos and several other affected families, asking if they would be comfortable with me sharing their stories in court. Most of them agreed, grateful that someone was willing to speak for them in a process where they otherwise wouldn't have a voice. I also did something that surprised even me. I hired a private investigator to look deeper into Charles's double life. I wanted to understand the full scope of what Patricia and her children had been through, because they were victims too, even if they weren't part of the criminal proceedings. What the investigator found was heartbreaking. Patricia had been living what she thought was a committed relationship with Charles for over 8 years. She believed they were building a life together, making financial decisions based on what she thought was their shared future. When the truth came out, she discovered that not only was Charles married to someone else, but he'd also been lying about his financial situation. The money he'd been contributing to their household was partly funding his other life with Elaine and Emma. Patricia's 8-year-old twins, Michael and James, had known Charles as their father figure. They'd been devastated when he suddenly disappeared from their lives after his arrest. Patricia had to get them into counseling to help them understand why the man they'd called Daddy Charles was suddenly gone and why strange people were asking them questions about their family. The investigator also found evidence that Charles had been making promises to both families that he couldn't keep. He told Elaine that they would be able to afford a bigger house once he got his next promotion. He told Patricia that they would be able to get married and buy a house together once he sorted out some financial issues from his previous relationship. Both women had been making life decisions based on lies. This information fundamentally changed how I viewed the situation. I'd initially seen this as a story about my family's betrayal of me, but I was beginning to understand that I was just one of many people they'd hurt. Their crimes weren't just abstract legal violations, they were betrayals of trust that had damaged multiple families and communities. I incorporated all of this into my victim impact statement, but I also did something else. I created a detailed report documenting the broader impact of their crimes and submitted it to each of the prosecutors handling their cases. I wanted to make sure the courts understood the full scope of the damage they'd caused. The prosecutor handling Elaine's case was particularly interested in my research. "We often don't get this level of detail about the community impact," she told me during a pre-hearing meeting. "Usually we focus on the financial losses to the organization, but understanding how it affected individual families makes the human cost much clearer." The insurance fraud prosecutor was equally appreciative. "Your analysis of the broader economic impact is exactly the kind of information we need to help judges understand why these crimes matter beyond just the immediate victims," he said. Even Charles's federal prosecutor found the information about Patricia and her children valuable context for understanding the full scope of his deception. As the hearing dates approached, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. For years, I'd felt like the family failure, the one who couldn't get her life together. But this process had shown me that my skills and attention to detail could make a real difference in people's lives. I was good at finding patterns, connecting dots, and presenting complex information in ways that helped people understand important issues. I started thinking about whether there might be a way to use these skills professionally. The cybersecurity field was always looking for people who could investigate financial crimes, and my experience with my family's cases had given me insights into how these schemes actually worked from the inside. But first, I had to get through the hearings and see this process through to the end. I didn't mention the fact that they were my family until the very end. I focused entirely on the impact of their crimes on the community, on the families who depended on the nonprofit Elaine had stolen from, on the honest policyholders who would pay higher premiums because of Emma's fraud, and on the taxpayers who would have to cover the enforcement costs of Charles's schemes. The day of the hearings, I dressed professionally and arrived early. I hadn't seen any of them since the day they'd kicked me out, and I was curious to see how they'd handle this moment. Charles looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his hair had gone completely gray, and he seemed to have aged a decade in 2 months. Elaine was barely holding herself together, clearly heavily medicated for anxiety. Emma was trying to maintain her composure, but I could see the fear in her eyes. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium and began reading my statement. I talked about the importance of trust in community institutions, about how financial crimes hurt the most vulnerable members of society, and about the ripple effects of fraud on honest citizens. Then, at the very end, I said, "Your Honor, I should mention that the defendants are my biological family. They are my father, my mother, and my sister. 6 weeks ago, they decided that I was no longer worth considering family and kicked me out of their home in the cruelest way possible. At the time, I thought that was the most hurtful thing they could do to me. I was wrong. The most hurtful thing was discovering that while they were treating me like a burden and a disappointment, they were engaging in activities that hurt our entire community. I don't speak today as their family member, they made it clear I'm not their family anymore. I speak as a member of the community they betrayed, and I ask that you consider the full impact of their choices on all of us who have to live with the consequences." The courtroom was completely silent when I finished. I could see Elaine crying, Charles staring at the floor, and Emma looking like she wanted to disappear entirely. The judge thanked me for my statement and dismissed me. I walked out of that courtroom and never looked back. Charles received 22 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay $45,000 in restitution to the IRS. His marriage to Elaine was dissolved through divorce proceedings, and he lost his insurance license permanently. Elaine received 18 months in state prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to the nonprofit, plus penalties and interest. The total came to over $200,000, which meant she'd probably be paying it off for the rest of her life. Emma and David both received 2 years in federal prison for their roles in the insurance fraud scheme. They were also ordered to pay restitution to the insurance companies they defrauded, which totaled nearly $120,000. Emma's wedding was obviously canceled, and David's family disowned him publicly. As for me, I used the time they were all busy with their legal troubles to rebuild my life completely. I found a new job with a cybersecurity firm that specialized in financial crimes investigation. My experience with my family's cases had apparently impressed some people in the industry. The pay was significantly better than my previous position, and the work was more interesting. I also started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and narcissistic abuse. It took months of sessions for me to fully understand how deeply their treatment had affected me, and how much of my adult life had been shaped by trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it. 9 months after the sentencing hearings, I received a letter from Elaine. It was written on standard prison stationery in her familiar handwriting. "Rachel," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just for the things we said when we asked you to leave, but for everything. For years of making you feel like you weren't good enough, for treating Emma better than you, for never appreciating who you really are." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing her regrets and asking for forgiveness. She talked about how prison had given her time to think about her gambling addiction and how it had affected her judgment. She mentioned that she'd started attending therapy and had begun to understand how badly she'd treated me. "I know I have no right to ask this," the letter concluded, "but I hope someday you might be willing to forgive us. Not for our sake, but for yours. I love you, and I'm proud of you, and I should have told you that every day instead of making you feel like a disappointment." I read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer and didn't respond. 3 weeks later, I got a similar letter from Charles. His was shorter and more focused on making excuses for his behavior, but it ended with a request to visit him in prison so they could work things out as a family. I threw this letter away without finishing it. Emma's letter came a month after that, and it was the most interesting of the 3. Instead of focusing on apologies or excuses, she wrote about how she'd been thinking about our childhood and how she'd realized that our parents had set us up to compete against each other instead of supporting each other. "I know I was awful to you," she wrote. "I know I said terrible things and acted like I was better than you. The truth is, I was always scared that if I wasn't perfect, they'd treat me the way they treated you. So I threw you under the bus to protect myself, and that makes me just as bad as they are." She went on to say that she'd been thinking about what it would be like to rebuild our relationship someday if you're ever willing to try. I kept Emma's letter, but I didn't respond to it either. The truth is, I wasn't ready to forgive any of them. Maybe I never would be. Their actions had consequences that went far beyond hurt feelings or family drama. They had committed crimes that affected real people, and they had only expressed remorse after they'd been caught and punished. More importantly, I'd learned that I didn't need their approval or their love to be happy. The family I'd spent my whole life trying to please had never really existed. It had been a fantasy built on conditional acceptance and emotional manipulation. A year after the sentencing, I was living in a new city, working a job I loved, and building relationships with people who appreciated me for who I actually was instead of who they wanted me to be. I'd started dating someone who thought my intelligence was attractive instead of threatening, and I'd made friends who valued loyalty and honesty over performance and appearances. One evening, I was having dinner with my boyfriend Mark when he asked me about my family. We'd been dating for several months, but I'd been vague about my background. "It's complicated," I said, which was my standard response. "Most families are," he replied. "But you never talk about them at all. Are you not close?" I considered how much to tell him. "My parents and sister are currently in prison for various financial crimes. We're not on speaking terms." He looked surprised but not judgmental. "That must have been really difficult to deal with." "Actually," I said, "it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones hurting you the most, and that you're better off without them than trying to fix something that was never really healthy to begin with. Do you ever think about reconciling with them?" I thought about Elaine's letter in my drawer, about Emma's reflection on our childhood, about Charles's request for a prison visit. "Sometimes," I admitted. But then I remember that actions have consequences, and that forgiveness isn't the same thing as forgetting. They made their choices, and I made mine. I choose to build a life with people who actually care about me instead of trying to fix relationships with people who only cared about me when it was convenient for them. Mark nodded thoughtfully. That sounds really healthy, actually. It is, I said. It took me a long time to learn that walking away from toxic people isn't giving up, it's choosing yourself. 3 years later, Emma was released from prison early for good behavior. She sent me a letter with her new address and phone number, asking if we could meet for coffee to talk. Elaine was released 8 months after that, and Charles was scheduled to be released the following year. I didn't respond to Emma's letter, but I did keep track of what they were doing through public records and social media. Emma had moved to a different state and was working as a waitress while trying to rebuild her life. Elaine was living in a small apartment and working part-time at a grocery store while paying off her restitution. Charles was still in prison but had apparently found religion and was writing letters to Patricia trying to reconcile with his sons. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if they hadn't sent those messages that Tuesday morning. If they treated me with basic human dignity during my recovery, would I have ever looked into their activities? Would they still be living their double lives, hurting other people, if they hadn't pushed me to the point where I stopped protecting them? I'll never know, and honestly, I don't think it matters. What matters is that they showed me who they really were, and I believe them. And in doing so, they freed me from spending the rest of my life trying to earn love from people who were never capable of giving it unconditionally. 3 years after that Tuesday morning, I was promoted to senior analyst at my firm. I helped solve dozens of financial crime cases, and I developed a reputation as someone who could find patterns that others missed. My colleagues respected my work, my friends valued my loyalty, and Mark had proposed with a ring that represented a future built on mutual respect instead of conditional acceptance. The day I got engaged, I thought about calling Elaine to share the news. For just a moment, I felt that old instinct to seek approval, to try one more time to have the mother-daughter relationship I'd always wanted. Instead, I called my therapist. That's a normal impulse, she assured me. It's natural to want to share good news with your family, even when that family has been harmful to you. But I don't actually want her at my wedding, I said. I don't want any of them there. I want to be surrounded by people who are genuinely happy for me, not people who will make it about themselves or their own drama. Then trust that instinct, she said. You've worked hard to build a life that makes you happy. You don't owe anyone access to that life, even if they're biologically related to you. So I didn't call Elaine. I didn't write to Emma. I didn't visit Charles in prison to share my good news. Instead, I planned a wedding with people who had chosen to love me, just as I had chosen to love them. I built a life based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine affection. I created the family I always wanted by choosing it deliberately instead of accepting it by default. And when people ask me about my family now, I tell them about Mark and our friends and the community we've built together. I tell them about the family we're planning to start, and how we're going to make sure our children know they're loved unconditionally. I don't talk about Elaine and Charles and Emma anymore, because they're not my family. They're just people I used to know who taught me some valuable lessons about self-respect and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who actually care about your well-being. The last I heard, they were all still trying to rebuild their lives after prison. Elaine had started attending Gamblers Anonymous and was working on paying off her restitution. Emma had enrolled in community college and was trying to get her life back on track. Charles had been released and was living in a halfway house while trying to find work with a felony record. I hope they've learned from their mistakes. I hope they've become better people. I hope they've found a way to build healthy relationships with others, even if they can't have one with me. But their growth and their healing is not my responsibility. My responsibility is to myself, to the life I built, and to the people who have chosen to be part of that life. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting back at the people who hurt you. Sometimes the best revenge is building such a good life without them that their absence becomes a gift instead of a loss. And that's exactly what I did.